The problem of legitimacy. We often think of history as a record of what happened, a collection of facts waiting to be discovered. But the story of Richard III shows us that history is often something else entirely. A story told by the winners. His reputation wasn't lost on the battlefield at Bosworth in 1485. It was constructed, deliberately and meticulously, in the years that followed. The Tudors had a problem, and Richard III was the solution. Henry Tudor's claim to the English throne was, to put it mildly, thin. He won his crown by conquest, by defeating the reigning king in battle. But to rule effectively, a new dynasty needs more than military victory. It needs legitimacy. It needs to convince the nobility and the people that its rule is not just a fact of power, but a matter of right. And the most effective way to do that is to prove that the previous ruler had no right to be there in the first place. This is where Richard became incredibly useful. He was the perfect narrative target. He was dead, so he couldn't defend himself. He died without leaving a direct heir, so there was no powerful family faction to protect his memory. And he was the last king of the House of York, a rival branch of the Plantagenet family that the Tudors had just supplanted. The Tudors needed to paint Richard not just as a bad king, but as a monstrous one, a usurper so evil that his overthrow wasn't just political opportunism, it was a moral necessity. They had to conquer memory along with territory. The central lesson here isn't about whether Richard was good or bad. It's that his reputation survived for centuries not because it was proven, but because it was useful. The Chroniclers campaign. So how do you launch a propaganda campaign in the 16th century? You start with the writers. The Tudors understood the power of the written word, and they patronized historians whose job was to tell the new official story of England. This wasn't about objective research. It was about crafting a narrative that served the state. The campaign began with Polydore Virgil, an Italian humanist hired by Henry VII. Virgil's Anglica Historia framed Richard's reign as a period of moral corruption, a necessary prelude to the virtuous rule of the Tudors. He established the core themes: Richard's physical deformity as an outward sign of inner wickedness, his ambition, and his ruthless elimination of rivals. This was history written with a very clear political purpose. Then came Thomas More. His history of King Richard III, written decades after the king's death, is less a historical record and more a dramatic character assassination. More, who never met Richard, crafted vivid, theatrical scenes of the king's villainy. He gave us the image of Richard as a scheming hunchback, openly plotting treason. It's crucial to remember that More's account was unfinished and never published in his lifetime, but it became a sourcebook for others precisely because of its powerful, memorable prose. He turned political history into a morality play. Edward Hall took these narratives and amplified them in his Chronicle, which was openly pro-Tudor. Hall wove together Virgil and More, selecting the most damning accusations and presenting them as established fact. His work created a streamlined, simplified version of events where the Yorkists were treacherous and the Tudors were saviors. Finally, Raphael Holinshed compiled these earlier chronicles into his famous Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland. This is where the process solidified. By compiling and repeating the accusations, Holinshed's work turned interpretation into reference. For later writers, including a certain playwright, Holinshed wasn't just one version of events, it was the version. This repetition created a powerful echo chamber. The absence of concrete evidence about, for example, the fate of the princes in the tower ceased to be a mystery. Through constant retelling, uncertainty itself became a form of evidence against Richard. The question shifted from, what proof is there, to, why would everyone say it if it weren't true? This is the mechanism by which a political narrative hardens into accepted history, Shakespeare's Amplification. The chroniclers laid the foundation, but it was William Shakespeare who built the cathedral. His play, Richard III, is often mistaken for the origin of the king's villainous reputation. But that's not quite right. Shakespeare wasn't the inventor. He was the ultimate amplifier. He took the narrative crafted by Virgil, Moore, and Holinshed and supercharged it for the masses. The theater, in Elizabethan England, was a powerful new medium. It didn't just inform people, it made them feel. It transformed dry political history from a chronicle into a visceral, emotional experience. Shakespeare's genius was in simplification. He took the complex political maneuvering of the Wars of the Roses and distilled it into a gripping story of one man's monstrous ambition. He gave Richard a charismatic, audience-addressing evil. The famous opening soliloquy, "Now is the winter of our discontent," made glorious summer by this son of York, immediately establishes Richard as an outsider, bitter and plotting. His physical deformity, exaggerated by the chroniclers, becomes the central metaphor for his moral corruption. Shakespeare didn't create this link, but he dramatized it with unforgettable power. On stage, the hunchback wasn't just a description. It was a physical presence that screamed villain to an audience accustomed to judging by appearances. The play also cemented specific accusations into popular consciousness. The murder of the princes in the Tower, presented as a historical uncertainty by the chroniclers, becomes in Shakespeare a chilling, definitive act ordered by a remorseless Richard. By putting the command on stage, he turned a debated event into a dramatic fact. This is where the story crossed over from history books into cultural memory. People who had never read Polydore Virgil or Thomas More knew the story of the evil hunchback king because they had seen it performed. And this is why Shakespeare's version proved more durable than the chroniclers. His play wasn't just read by scholars. It was performed, reprinted, and eventually taught in schools for centuries. It spilled over into visual culture, influencing how painters and illustrators depicted Richard. The character became an archetype, the scheming, physically deformed usurper that was easy to understand and hard to forget. Shakespeare didn't create the Tudor narrative, he made it unforgettable. He embedded it so deeply into the English-speaking world's psyche that for hundreds of years, to question Richard's guilt was to argue against Shakespeare himself. The story no longer required verification because it felt true, the modern disruption. For centuries, the Tudor Shakespearean narrative was the default setting for understanding Richard III. It was taught in schools, depicted in art, and accepted as common knowledge. But then, evidence started to talk back. The modern era, with its tools of archaeology and forensic science, began to disrupt this long-settled story, not by declaring Richard innocent, but by challenging the confidence with which his guilt had been asserted for so long. The most dramatic disruption began in 2012 with the archaeological excavation of a parking lot in Leicester. The discovery of Richard's lost grave was a monumental event, but the real significance was in the material evidence it provided. Here was the actual king, not a character from a play. The forensic analysis of his skeleton delivered two crucial correctives. First, it confirmed he had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine. But crucially, it showed this was not the dramatic hunchback of legend. He would have had one shoulder slightly higher than the other, but he was not the grotesquely deformed figure of Shakespeare. This was a powerful lesson. A physical difference, noted by chroniclers, had been weaponized and exaggerated over time into a symbol of moral evil. The forensic evidence didn't change the historical fact of his condition, but it completely changed its implication. Second, the analysis of his remains provided a grimly detailed account of his death at Bosworth Field, showing the brutal violence of his final moments. This physical evidence grounded the king back in reality, pulling him out of the realm of pure myth and propaganda. It forced historians to look at the man, not just the monster of the narrative. The 2015 reburial of Richard III in Leicester Cathedral was equally significant for what it revealed about changing public perception. The ceremony was a moment of national reflection, a far cry from the centuries of vilification. It wasn't a declaration of his innocence, but a recognition of his place in history and a dignified closing of a very long chapter. The public response showed a widespread desire to see a more nuanced human figure emerge from the shadows of caricature. The modern reassessment teaches us a vital lesson about historical certainty. Archaeology and science didn't rewrite history to prove Richard was a good king. Instead, they reopened questions that had been considered settled. They forced us to distinguish between what we know from evidence and what we've inherited from a powerful, politically motivated story. The case of Richard III shows us that historical reputation is often a fragile thing, built more on utility and repetition than on a solid foundation of proof. The uncomfortable truth is that we must always question the stories we're told, especially when they are as simple, as morally clear, and as useful to those in power as the story of the wicked King Richard. His legacy is a permanent warning about the politics of memory, the uncomfortable truth. So where does that leave us with Richard III? The real takeaway isn't about rehabilitating a medieval king or declaring a final verdict. It's about understanding the mechanism of history itself. Richard's reputation survived for centuries, not because it was proven, but because it was useful. It served a vital political purpose for the Tudor dynasty, and later, it served a narrative purpose for playwrights and teachers who needed a clear-cut villain. This is the uncomfortable truth about historical memory. It is often shaped by power. The stories that endure are frequently the ones that serve a purpose for those who tell them. Richard III stands as a powerful case study, a permanent warning against accepting historical narratives at face value, especially when they are simple, morally clear, and perfectly convenient. The next time you encounter a piece of common knowledge about a historical figure, ask yourself, who benefits from this story? You might just find a more complex and far more interesting truth waiting to be uncovered.
If you want history examined, not inherited, subscribe to Time Teller Chronicles.
New episodes weekly.